further increase the protection of our critical infrastructure in light of the sabotage of the Nord Stream pipelines, and we will step up and sustain our support for Ukraine, so that we can continue, so they can continue to defend themselves and liberate territory from Russian occupation. Ukraine has the momentum and continues to make significant gains, while Russia is increasingly resorting to horrific and indiscriminate attacks on civilians and critical infrastructure. President Putin is failing in Ukraine. His attempted annexations, partial mobilization, and reckless nuclear rhetoric represents the most significant escalation since the start of the war. And they show that this war is not going as planned. NATO is not party to the conflict, but our support is playing a key role. NATO is not Ukraine's sovereignty and self-defense. Ukraine's Defense Minister Oleksiy Reznikov will join us tomorrow, both for the US-led contact group for Ukraine and for a dinner with NATO ministers. Together we will address Ukraine's urgent needs. I welcome the recent announcements by allies to provide more advanced air defense systems and other capabilities to Ukraine, and I look forward to further deliveries. Our message is clear. NATO stands with Ukraine for as long as it takes. President Putin started this war. He must end it by withdrawing his forces from Ukraine. And President Lukashenko should stop the complicity of Belarus in this illegal conflict. On Thursday, I will chair a regular meeting of the Nuclear Planning Group. The fundamental purpose of NATO's nuclear deterrent has always been to preserve peace, prevent coercion, and deter aggression. Next week, NATO will hold its long-planned deterrence exercise, Steadfast Noon. This is routine training which happens every year to keep our deterrent safe, secure, and effective. President Putin's veiled nuclear threats are dangerous and irresponsible. Russia knows that the nuclear war cannot be won and must never be fought. We are closely monitoring Russia's nuclear forces. We have not seen any changes in Russia's posture, but we remain vigilant. At the Madrid summit in June, NATO leaders decided a fundamental shift in our defense and deterrence to respond to the new security reality. We have doubled the number of NATO battle groups in the east of the alliance. They can be scaled up quickly to brigade size. We are also increasing the number of our high readiness forces. At this ministerial, we will take decisions to increase our stockpiles of munitions and equipment, to speed up the delivery of capabilities, and to use the NATO defense planning process to provide industry with the long-term demand they need to boost production. We will also address the protection of critical infrastructure. NATO has been working on this for many years, and following the sabotage of the Nord Stream pipelines, we have further enhanced our vigilance across all domains. We have doubled our presence in the Baltic and North Seas to over 30 ships, supported by maritime patrol aircraft and undersea capabilities. These efforts are closely coordinated by NATO's Maritime Command. Allies are also increasing security around key installations and stepping up intelligence and intelligence sharing. We will take further steps to strengthen our resilience and protect our critical infrastructure. Any deliberate attack against Allies' critical infrastructure would be met with a united and determined response. Our final session will focus on NATO's missions and operations, from Kosovo to Iraq. We will be joined by EU High Representative Borrell, because NATO and the European Union face the same security challenges. We have a difficult winter ahead, so it's even more important that North America and Europe continue to stand united in support for Ukraine and in defense of our people. And with that, I'm ready to take your questions.
We'll start at the very top with Deutsche Welle, NPR.
Thank you. Mr. Secretary General, you said that you will be making decisions at this meeting about how to increase national stockpiles and keep your arsenals full while supplying more to Ukraine. But for example, with the air defense, the air-to-air missile system that Germany is sending, that was something that Germany was expecting to order for itself. Estonia has sent its entire shipment of javelins to Ukraine. So are you worried that while allies are supplying Ukraine with everything they can, they are leaving themselves unprotected at home? And what will be your deliverables out of this meeting that will change that in terms of manufacturing processes and streamlining this? Thank you.
So, NATO allies have provided unprecedented support to Ukraine with capabilities, weapons, ammunition, different types of military support. And that is something, of course, we welcome, and we have encouraged this from NATO ever since the invasion started. Actually, we did that before the invasion. We have to remember that NATO allies have provided support to Ukraine since 2014, including training tens of thousands of Ukrainian officers, soldiers, which are now playing a key role in the defense against the Russian aggression against Ukraine. But after the invasion, allies stepped up. And of course, very much of the support that NATO allies have provided, the javelins, the air defense systems, the ammunition they have provided to Ukraine, that has been taken from existing stocks. So by doing that, they have reduced their stocks. But that has been the right thing to do. Because it is important for all of us that Ukraine wins the battle, the war against the invading Russian forces. Because if Putin wins, that is not only a big defeat for the Ukrainians, but it will be defeat and dangerous for all of us, because it will make the world more dangerous, and it will make us more vulnerable for further Russian aggression. So that's the reason why we have used NATO stocks in NATO allied countries, to provide support to Ukraine. But of course, the longer this war drags on, the more important it is that we also then are able to replenish these stocks. And that's exactly why we now are addressing how can we ramp up production, so we can produce more, both to replenish stocks, but also to continue to support Ukraine. And I expect ministers to make decisions at the ministerial meeting tomorrow and the day after tomorrow on how to use the NATO defense planning process to agree on the more ambitious targets on, for instance, different capabilities, including looking into the possibility of increasing the targets, the guidelines for stocks. This will provide the industry with the long-term demand they need to invest in new production capabilities, because they have been able to increase production partly by utilizing existing production capacity more, but to really ramp up production, they need to make new investments. I also expect them to agree on how we can further strengthen our interoperability, ensure that allies can work together, and also jointly purchase ammunition capabilities, partly to reduce stocks, but also to actually ensure interoperability between allies. And the unique NATO defense planning process is, I think, the best tool to ensure that allies are coordinated and actually provide the long-term demand messages to industry to ramp up production.
Okay, we'll go to Associated Press. Just there. Thanks.
Yes, Lorne Cook from the Associated Press. I have a question on infrastructure. Germany was, well, how can I put it? Deutsche Bahn had its communications cables severed over the weekend in Germany, cut off transport in the north of the country. We've also seen the leaks to the pipelines, obviously Nord Stream going to Germany. At what point do these attacks, do these incidents then become acts of war? And how does NATO respond to that as a collective alliance? You said the allies would respond, but how do you do that in this kind of instance? Thank you.
Over the last years, NATO has implemented the biggest transformation of collective defense since the end of the Cold War. And part of that is to take fully into account hybrid threats, cyber threats. And therefore also stated a few years ago that hybrid and cyber attacks can trigger Article 5, can constitute an armed attack against a NATO ally. And we have stepped up both our work on resilience, the protection of critical infrastructure. We are conducting more exercises both on hybrid threats and cyber threats, and we are exchanging best practices, and we've also agreed guidelines on the protection of the critical infrastructure. All of this is about protecting, for instance, undersea capabilities or undersea infrastructure, pipelines, cables, but also, of course, energy grids, energy production, transportation infrastructure. Of course, I cannot comment on those specific incidents because there are ongoing investigations, and I think we need to await the outcome of this investigation before we make any final judgment. But in general, I can say that, of course, we are closely monitoring every incident that may constitute a hybrid or cyber attack against NATO allies. And we are ready to take the necessary measures if needed. Exactly what kind of measure depends on the nature of the attack, and we will never give our potential adversaries the privilege of defining exactly where the threshold for Article 5 goes. That will be a decision we make as allies, taking into account the precise context, the specific situation we will face if there is a hybrid or cyber attack against the NATO ally.
Interfax Ukraine, lady in the middle there.
Thank you, Anna. Secretary General, according to Americans and Ukrainians, yesterday's strike on Ukraine were planned in advance and nothing to do with Kerch Bridge, as Russian claims. And moreover, some analysts also said that Ukraine have nothing to do with Kerch Bridge, which was simply used as pretext for this strike. Does NATO share the same assessment? And do you think, is this a turning point of this war? What could it change on the battlefield? And some short follow-up to Terry's question. You said that ministers will discuss how refill stocks only tomorrow, but war is going on already for 7 months. Why it was not done before? Thank you.
So first, we have already, of course, started the dialogue with the industry and with the different allies on how to ramp up production and refill or replenish our stocks. We had a meeting of the NATO armament directors a couple of weeks ago here in NATO, so this is an ongoing work. But when all the ministers meet tomorrow, of course, that provides an excellent opportunity to take stock of what we have achieved, how far we have been able to move on ramping up production, but also then to make new decisions on how to further ensure that we are not only digging into existing stocks to provide support to Ukraine, but actually also able to ramp up production. And we need to ramp up production of ammunitions and weapons to both ensure the deterrence on defense our own allies, NATO allies, but also to have enough to continue for the long haul to provide support to Ukraine. But just to prevent any misunderstanding, this work doesn't start now. It has been going on for some time, but of course the longer the war in Ukraine continues, this work on
I believe that press conference of NATO Secretary General ahead of the NATO Defence Ministers meeting happening tomorrow. And we can now go to Brussels, to NATO HQ, where my colleague Terry Schulz is standing by. Terry, you've just been there at the press conference. We heard the NATO Secretary General ahead of the NATO meeting that will last for the coming 2 days. What do you think we can expect from that meeting?
Well, first and foremost, of course, the allies will want to show a united front against Russia, especially against these recent attacks that were so brutal. Secretary General called them horrific. They will also be taking stock of whether President Putin's nuclear rhetoric is indeed a sign that he is increasing the possibility of using nuclear weapons. Secretary General Stoltenberg just said that they have seen no sign that the posture has actually changed, despite President Putin's comments clearly trying to scare the West. They will also be looking at how they can do more to protect the infrastructure. After we saw these attacks on the Nord Stream pipeline, the damage of this spill, of course, causing huge environmental damage. This is something that NATO has known is a vulnerability of its allies for a long time, and they will be looking at what more they can do to protect this infrastructure. Mentioning also, of course, the sabotage on German railways over the weekend. So this is definitely something allies are going to be looking at, as well as how they can continue to supply Ukraine with an ever-increasing need for weapons.
That's one of the big issues, I believe, staying on course in its support for Ukraine. That's easier said than done, isn't it?
Certainly, NATO has said that it will stick with Ukraine as long as it takes, but that's looking to be longer and longer, again, with these recent attacks showing that Moscow has no intention of withdrawing from the territory inside Ukraine that it's been occupying. And allies are having to look at what they can do to continue sending weapons to Ukraine at this level, or even increasing it. I looked at that ahead of this meeting at just how they're going to dig deeper. Let's take a look. Spend more, make more, send more. NATO allies are under pressure to continue supplying Ukraine with increasingly sophisticated weapons while maintaining their own stockpiles up to alliance standards. For Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky, it's straightforward.
Increase the supply of weapons and ammunition to defend against the Russian pressure. Increase the manufacture of weapons and ammunition in Europe to be always ready to defend our common space.
But some allies are voicing concerns they can't keep this up. Money's getting tighter, and weapons manufacturing is a slow process. According to the American think tank, the Center for Strategic and International Studies, even the leading arms supplier, the United States, may be running low on key weapons. But NATO's head of defense investment says for most countries, the cupboards are not bare yet.
Ultimately, I do believe that many allies can do somewhere between a little more and a lot more, but that has to come from a decision and also a very honest assessment of what's the state of their own stockpiles.
Grant says NATO is helping allies become more comfortable with sharing their stockpiles with Ukraine by working on ways to speed up production, resupply, and interoperability so countries can share stocks. Such changes are essential, Grant says, to weather both the war in Ukraine and whatever the future holds.
In the long run, we want to make sure that in an environment in which high-intensity warfare has made a dramatic comeback in the European security landscape, we are at the right level.
Some allies aren't waiting for new solutions. Topping the list of donors to Ukraine as a percentage of their GDP, the Baltic states and Poland.
They have been occupied by the Soviet Union. They have experience with what Russians do.
Former Estonian President Toomas Ilves notes his country is spending more of its GDP on aid to Ukraine than some NATO allies spend on their own militaries.
We bought a lot of javelins and we gave them all to Ukraine. And the idea is that every tank, every T-72 that gets knocked out by an Estonian Javelin in Ukraine is one T-72 we don't have to knock out with our Javelins at home.
Ukraine's former foreign minister, Pavlo Klimkin, also urges NATO countries not to make a distinction between helping his country and protecting themselves.
The real eastern flank of NATO, although an informal one, is also in Ukraine. So to have a strategic vision on how to deliver weapons to Ukraine is a point of being credible for the West.
Klimkin hopes this increased integration will also speed the process of Ukraine becoming the formal eastern flank of NATO once the war is over.
So supplies and money, in the end, becoming an issue there. We've seen you asking Stoltenberg in that press conference earlier about these issues. Do you think he's worried that funding Ukraine will drain resources for NATO?
What Assistant Secretary Camille Grand explained to me is that there's a difference between the comfort zone and the danger zone when it comes to stockpiles. And he said that no country is anywhere near the danger zone, where they actually wouldn't have enough munitions or other equipment in stock to defend themselves or to help defend other NATO countries if it came to that. But what they are working on is making that comfort zone broader so that, for example, more countries use the same ammunition, so that stockpiling is easier, so that manufacturing orders can be larger. That makes a lot of sense, and that's something Secretary General Stoltenberg said he hopes will come out of this meeting, that allies will look at ways to be more interoperable, to make even joint procurements, something which we haven't really seen to a large extent up to now. But the war in Ukraine is changing the way everybody looks at defense.
The W's. Terry Schultz there at NATO headquarters in Brussels. Thank you, Terry. In the wake of Monday's Russian rocket assault, security services in Ukraine are reporting more strikes in the south and the west of the country. Ukrainian authorities say at least 12 missiles have slammed into public facilities in the southern city of Zaporizhia, killing at least one person. The explosions set off a large fire in the area. Now, leaders of the group of 7 countries, the G7, are meeting virtually today to discuss further support for Kyiv, including help to rebuild Ukraine's damaged infrastructure following